I am Asoke Mukherjee. I was in the Indian Foreign Service for more than 37 years. It was an interesting experience for me to understand not only how to represent India internationally, but also to understand how the world around us impacts on us. Today, I wanted to speak on the connection between India and international organizations. We call it multilateralism. And that's important because it's a dimension of India's foreign policy which is often either taken for granted or not spoken about too much. The story that I wanted to talk about starts about a century ago in 1914 in August, when a ship brought Mahatma Gandhi from South Africa. He was on his way back to India. It docked at London. The First World War was declared on that day, and Mahatma Gandhi was taken by a group of Indian political activists, including Jinnah, Sarojini Naidu, Gokhale, to a hotel called Hotel Cecil in London. And there they had a discussion on what Indian political opinion wanted to do with this war that had been declared. Because India was a colony, and the British government, which controlled British India, had declared the war on behalf of the entire British Empire. It took 2 days for Mahatma Gandhi and his colleagues to circulate a proposal that essentially stated that we will support the Indian participation in the First World War in the expectation that when the war ends, India would get a degree of political independence and freedom. It was on this basis that in the next 4 years, more than 1 million Indians volunteered and joined the different units of the Indian Armed Forces, essentially the Indian Army, and fought in as many as 7 different theaters of that global conflict. Out of those more than 1 million, more than 60,000 gave their lives. And if you go down to India Gate today in Delhi, you will see the names of those thousands of soldiers who gave their lives fighting in this war. When the war ended, a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Versailles, 28th of June 1919, and the participation of people who would sign that treaty was discussed. And India signed that treaty basically because of 2 reasons. One was soldiers from India who had fought in the First World War, and as important, the tremendous financial and resource contributions made by India to the First World War. India gave 100 million pounds in 1917 from the treasury in Delhi to London as a loan for prosecuting the war. That today is worth more than 2.5 million pounds. Now, this is the kind of rationale which accounts for a very odd anomaly that a colony signs a treaty, an international treaty, as an equal party. But it happened, and on the 10th of January 1920, which is almost 100 years ago, the first international organization was created by this treaty. The organization was known as the League of Nations. Now, Indian diplomacy, which marks many anniversaries, probably will have to mark the anniversary in 1920 of the first Indian diplomatic mission which was set up abroad by the end of the First World War and because of the end of the First World War. And that was essentially the Indian High Commission in London. The High Commission was created by an Act of Parliament of the United Kingdom, the Government of India Act of 1919. And the core function of that High Commission was to implement the Treaty of Versailles, which required Germany to pay reparations for having caused the First World War. Because of India's contributions to the First World War, the reparations were due from Germany to India as well. And in the course of the next 10 years, until the reparations were stopped in 1930, the Indian High Commission was engaged as the agent of British India in Europe to procure material for the construction of India's infrastructure, including the Indian railways. These were built with material bought from European countries, very often ignoring competing claims from British manufacturing industry. And they formed the subject of a very interesting series of debates in the British House of Commons in the 1920s. So while the first diplomatic mission of India started in 1920 in London, the international organization of which India became a part, the League of Nations, started functioning. And the Indian High Commissioner in London represented India in the League of Nations, as well as in 1922 in the first modern structure of global governance that was created, which is known as the International Labour Organization. The International Labour Organization is very unique. It brings together governments, it brings together labor, and it brings together the employers of labor. So it's a tripartite structure. And from 1922 onwards, most people are amazed to hear it, India has been among the permanent 10 countries represented in the Governing Council of the International Labour Organization. Since 1922, India has been considered what they call a country of chief industrial importance. Now, this is something that I think is relevant when we look at India and multilateralism today. The work that the International Labour Organization did focused essentially through the participation of the Indian High Commissioner in London on two issues. One was the condition of Indian labor working in plantations in countries like Malaysia or in East Africa. And very often, the position taken by the Indian envoy was at odds with the position of the British government, and there were criticisms made of the role of the Indian diplomacy in this international organization. So when we look back at these kinds of examples, it's easy to see that there is a long pedigree of India's positions in international affairs, in international organizations, being at variance with what is considered to be mainstream thought, especially in terms of the big powers. In 1934, assassination took place of the King of Yugoslavia and the Foreign Minister of France in the port city of Marseille. The French initiated a convention which they wanted the League of Nations to adopt, and India was among the first supporters of that initiative. It attracted 27 countries. It was signed by India, and India was the only country to have ratified it in 1941. And then the League of Nations had collapsed, the Second World War started. So the Treaty on Combating International Terrorism was overtaken by the Second World War. But it's important to look back at this as the first time that a country like India, on its own, without the United Kingdom pushing it to, signed and ratified an international instrument like the Treaty Against Terrorism. The core of that treaty was a principle which is even relevant to us today, the principle that if you are harboring an alleged criminal, a terrorist in this case, then you either you prosecute the terrorist in your jurisdiction or you extradite him for prosecution. The terrorists were the ones who had assassinated the King of Yugoslavia and the Foreign Minister of France. They were being given refuge in Mussolini's Italy. The Italian government refused to prosecute them or extradite them, and that is why France took this initiative to try and use international law to bring about justice. I mention this because you look at it today, we are trying to get the people who committed the terror attack in Mumbai in November 2008. We know where they are. We are asking for them to be either prosecuted or to be extradited for prosecution to another country which can do so. And yet, this principle is still not implemented in practice in the world as it is in 2018. So it's a long, long experience that we have with the kind of difficulties that are faced by attempts to apply international law to international relations. But this is the kind of background which led to the second big marker in India's participation in multilateral affairs and international organizations, and that is the outbreak of the Second World War. Unlike the First World War, the Second World War for political activists in India was a cause of division. There were political parties which did not support the declaration of war by the British Empire, and there were political parties which wanted to support the British war effort. At the time the war started, the British Empire in 1939 was probably the one of the big powers which was fully drawn into the war along with France. By 1941, you had a situation where Britain and the British Empire was probably the only major opponent to the growing advances of Hitlerism and fascism. The second big conflagration of the 20th century, the Second World War, began in September 1939. It was a time when the big powers were divided. On the one side, you had France, which was invaded by Germany, and you had Britain on the side of France. On the other side, you had the Soviet Union aligned with Germany, and you had the United States independent and neutral, not participating on either side of this war. The first 2 years of the Second World War were momentous years. Within India, there was a division of political opinion on whether to support the British Empire's war effort or whether to oppose it. Major parties like the Indian National Congress opposed participating in the British Empire's war effort, and yet there were volunteers who volunteered to serve in the British Indian Army, and there were the Indian princely states who also supported the British war effort. By 1941, the war was proceeding in a way in which the British Empire was isolated. France had been overrun. The United States still had not entered the war because Pearl Harbor hadn't taken place. The Russian-Soviet alliance with Germany had not yet ended. It was not yet in June 1941 when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. At that point of time, India was a very active and participant in the Second World War and had contributed more than 2.5 million volunteers to fight as part of the British Indian Army, the British Imperial Army in the war that was going on. And it's this background and this context that is important when we look at the creation of the next major international organization that comes about at this point of time. Britain and the United States had a meeting on a ship in the Atlantic Ocean. They agreed on a method, they agreed on the way forward if they were able to succeed in winning the war. What they signed was known as the Atlantic Charter, but the United States felt that without broadening the support for the principles of the Atlantic Charter, the Charter could not be implemented. And therefore, on the 1st of January 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States convened a meeting in Washington of 26 nations who were part of the Allied armies fighting on the ground in the Second World War against Germany, against Japan, and against Italy. And it was this conference which set the tone for the international institutions that we see around us today, because it issued a declaration, and the declaration, interestingly enough, is called Declaration by the United Nations. So out of these 26 countries, India was one of the participants. And this was the agent or the representative of British India who was assigned as a diplomatic envoy in Washington, D.C. His name was Sir Girija Shankar Bajpai from the Indian Civil Service, and he signed this declaration on behalf of India on the 1st of January 1942. The declaration set in motion a process which culminated in the creation of the international organizations that we see today and of which India is an integral part. The first process that was initiated under this declaration was a judicial or a process to bring to justice people who are committing war crimes during the Second World War. The creation of what is called the United Nations War Crimes Commission in 1943 was a momentous event because for the first time, while the war was being prosecuted, you had from the field reports being filed by the armies of what they had seen while fighting and especially with regard to the commission of mass atrocity crimes like genocide. These reports were considered by the UN War Crimes Commission, which was headquartered in London. The Indian representative was again the High Commissioner of India, at that time Sir Samuel Ranganathan, again an officer. And it was an interesting experience because it created the background to what the world today is confronted with when dealing with mass atrocity crimes. There was an opinion that we should use these reports that are coming in from the field to initiate legal proceedings to prosecute the people who are committing these war crimes. And yet, within that same commission, the great powers, the four of them, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Republic of China, they said that no, we should apply the principles of military justice to prosecuting these crimes. And because of the inability of countries like India and Belgium and some other European countries to carry the opinion in their favor, the outcome of the UN War Crimes Commission was the creation of two military tribunals at the end of the Second World War. One was the tribunal at Nuremberg, and the other was the Tokyo Tribunal. Many in India remember and are often reminded of the role of the Indian judge at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, Justice Radha Binod Pal. Not many people know that the reason why Justice Pal opposed the way in which the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was being conducted was because of a legal perspective. And his view was that this is a kangaroo court, a military tribunal. These people who are arraigned in the dock before us should be tried in a non-military, rule of law-based justice procedure. And this is something that is, again, important to remember when we look at India's position on why we want a comprehensive convention against international terrorism today. It is a belief that it is only through the rule of law applied in a transparent and equitable manner that you can sustain the result of prosecuting crimes that you want to sustain. If you do it through other ways like military tribunals, you may not be able to sustain the outcomes that come out of those processes. In 1944, the second of the UN processes culminated in a place called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States with the creation of two institutions, one known as the International Monetary Fund and the other known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which we often call the World Bank. 44, by this time, the group of 26 countries which had met in Washington in 1942 had grown to 44. So 44 countries negotiated the documents which set up the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the Indian delegation was represented, apart from the representative of British India, British civil servants, by two very interesting professional figures who were to play a role in independent India shortly thereafter. One was Mr. Shetty, who became the first finance minister of independent India, and the other was Mr. Deshmukh, who also became the finance minister of independent India and who became the chair of the joint meeting of the IMF and the World Bank in 1950. So for many in India who feel that all these institutions were created without India being part of it, I think that this is something that we need to remember and talk about, that India was very much part of the creation of these institutions. And this happened even with regard to the United Nations itself, which was created through the UN Charter in 1945. Now, if you look at the Charter of the United Nations, you will see that it embodies the principle of one country, one vote, which means it embodies the principle of democracy in international relations. However, there is one part of that charter, and there's one article in the charter, Article 27.3, which gives to 5 countries the non-democratic privilege of being permanent members of the Security Council, without whose concurrence no decision of that Security Council can be taken. And I think that this is the big contradiction of the UN Charter, which we are faced with even today, and which, in a sense, drives the Indian campaign to become a permanent member of the Security Council. And yet, if you look back at 1945, the rest of the UN Charter, in a very open, democratic way, creates the structures of governance which are under the United Nations. It creates the General Assembly, where it's one country, one vote. It creates the Economic and Social Council, again with one country, one vote. And many years later, that General Assembly creates the Human Rights Council, again with one country, one vote. India's role in this process cannot be overemphasized, and yet I think it cannot be ignored. India, for example, was the first president of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, a body which, until the Human Rights Council was created in 2006, a body which looked after not only the economic developmental issues of the globe, but also the human rights issues. And it was under the Economic and Social Council and under India's presidency of that council in 1946 and 1947 that several initiatives were taken to set in place the first international legal structures to uphold fundamental human rights and freedoms. For example, 1946, India was the first country in the General Assembly to inscribe the concern that the policy of discrimination in South Africa against people who are not white was against the core principles of the United Nations Charter of democracy and equality. And from 1946, this campaign, which was initiated by India, gathered more and more support as more and more countries became independent and threw off colonial rule, and culminated many years later in 1994, when in April, South Africa conducted its first multiracial elections, and in May, President Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. The second example, which again is not spoken of very often, goes back to that period, is what happened to the attempts to outlaw the big crime which had seared the human consciousness in the Second World War, and that was the Holocaust. There was a man, an activist called Raphael Lemkin, who had been agitating about the possibility of genocide against the Jews even before the Second World War had begun. And yet he was not able to convince world leaders to give priority to this issue. After the end of the Second World War, when the Allied armies liberated the concentration camps where 6 million Jews had been killed, Raphael Lemkin's advocacy became extremely relevant. And yet he was not able to use the big powers, the permanent members of the Security Council, to do anything about these concerns. He then came to the General Assembly, and there he met Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was the leader of the Indian delegation in 1946, and he convinced her that India should co-sponsor a resolution in the General Assembly which would mandate the negotiation of the first convention, legal convention, outlawing mass atrocity crimes, which is known as the UN Convention on Genocide. And this happened within 2 years. In December 1948, the UN Convention on Genocide was negotiated and adopted, and it is the first legal instrument on outlawing mass atrocity crimes. The story goes on even in the area of human rights. In India's freedom struggle, men and women had been participating equally in opposing British rule. So when the United Nations decided to draw up its first charter on human rights, known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Indian delegate nominated to represent India in this drafting process was a lady who had been active in the Indian freedom movement. Her name was Hansa Mehta. She was from Baroda in Gujarat. She sat and looked at the draft that was being proposed, and the chairperson of this drafting committee was the widow of President Franklin Roosevelt. Her name was Eleanor Roosevelt. And she said that I cannot agree with this draft of the first article that is being proposed. So Mrs. Roosevelt looked at her and said, but what's wrong with it? It follows the constitution that we have. And the line read that all men are created equal. And Hansa Mehta said, no, based on my experience and our experience in India, in which men and women have been fighting equally, we cannot have a sentence in the first human rights treaty of the United Nations which says that all men are created equal. So she was asked, what do you suggest as a solution? And she suggested, let us put the words, all human beings are created equal. And despite initial opposition, that was the formulation that was accepted. So when you open the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and you read Article 1, you'll see it says all human beings are created equal. Now that's the kind of contribution that India was making when the international organizations were being created. And I think it's important to keep this in mind when we look at the reason why an organization like the United Nations is sometimes looked at with a lot of suspicion in India today. And the reason for that is from 1947. Now in 1947, India became independent in August, and the only thing that changed in terms of India's representation in the United Nations was that the flag of British India was replaced by the tricolour of independent India. The rest of the representation carried on with the issues that they had introduced in the agenda before. And interestingly enough, as a newly independent country, India decided that it needed to sit at the high table where the political issues of the United Nations were being discussed. Because so far India had been looking at the economic, the social, human rights issues, but India had not been really looking at the political issues because there was no place at that table as long as the United Kingdom represented the British Empire. But once India became independent, India sought a place at the high table of where political issues were discussed, and that is the UN Security Council. So soon after independence, in August 1947, India announced its candidacy for election to one of the non-permanent seats of the Security Council. Elections to this seat were held in October, but India could not get the two-thirds vote which is needed under the UN Charter to be elected. There were only 51 countries. The country which was also claiming the same seat was Ukraine. And between India and Ukraine, there were several rounds of balloting, but neither country could get two-thirds majority. And it was at a time when in India a lot of things were happening, but especially at the end of October, the tribal invasions and then the Pakistani armed action in Jammu and Kashmir took place, catalyzed the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India, and India therefore was faced with the violation of its territorial integrity in Jammu and Kashmir. And yet, this is one of those questions of history. On the 13th of November 1947, India got up in the General Assembly and announced that it was conceding the election to the UN Security Council to Ukraine, and it withdrew from the scene. And this is something that probably has haunted India from that day onwards till today, because without being present in the Security Council, India took its complaint on the 1st of January 1948 on the violation of its territorial integrity in Kashmir to the Security Council. It presented its case, and you had an Indian delegation which included a cabinet minister, Gopalaswamy Iyengar, and you had also the leader of the new popular regime in Jammu and Kashmir, Sheikh Abdullah, presenting the case for India. And yet, from the 1st of January 1948, when the complaint was made, till the 22nd of January 1948, in those 3 weeks, India was not sitting inside the Security Council when it was deciding on what to do with India's complaint. And therefore, it came to India as a shock when on 22nd of January 1948, the Security Council concluded its meeting and said that, yes, we will take cognizance of what India has brought to the agenda, but the issue is not the violation of the territorial integrity of India. The issue is the India-Pakistan question. And that created this situation in which India was not able to influence the outcome of how the Security Council would proceed to deal with the India-Pakistan question. Because India is not in the Security Council as a permanent member from 1948 till today, it has not been able to take this issue off the agenda of the Council. Till today, the India-Pakistan question is regularly inscribed as an item on the Security Council agenda. And as long as that item remains on the agenda, the Damocles sword of any of the permanent members of the Security Council using the presence of that item to reactivate international multilateral initiative on Jammu and Kashmir remains a constant shadow for Indian diplomacy. And I think that this is where I would like to conclude what I've been speaking about, because this, in a sense, sets the stage for looking at the evolution of the Kashmir issue, the creation of Pakistan, and related matters of Indian diplomacy.